From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome once again to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I am Ken Davis, welcoming you and thanking you for joining us for another conversation about our city, the city of Chicago, where things are always happening. And the thing that was happening yesterday and that a lot of people are talking about today happened over at the boardroom of the Chicago Public Schools, where they passed a $5.4 billion operating budget. And it's incredible. Mayor Emanuel was able to convince every single member of the school board to vote in favor of that budget. He's a very persuasive guy, isn't he? Also, there was a few other things in there, just, $1.5 billion here and $500 million there for different things. And of course, that's going to mean $245 for the average taxpayer in Chicago, because it's on your property taxes, maybe on your sewer bill and all that. We need somebody here to help us understand this, an expert, somebody who has been covering this for a long time. And we turn, of course, to the august Chicago Tribune for that. Juan Perez Jr., it's about time we've had you at the table. Thanks so much for coming in for your first appearance here.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure's all mine.
So, take us to the board meeting yesterday. There's something weird about the atmospherics of this. It's a new boardroom. They haven't been there very long. They just moved into it. It's a lot smaller. And there's something about it that says, shut up and sit down and don't say anything. And it was just really interesting to me that there were almost no comments yesterday on anything.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you get 2 minutes to speak.
Well, there's that.
You got your little shot clock there. Mm-hmm. That's always.
And it has to be said that it's got to be the most intimidating thing in the world. This giant clock on the screen counting down. And I hadn't experienced this before. I went to one of the budget meetings the other day, and they actually have a security guard who comes over and removes the microphone from your face at 2 minutes and 5 seconds.
And if you really insist, they will physically, do their best to coax you off the stage. That is, of course, unless you're an elected official or a CTU officer or something like that. They tend to get a little bit more flexibility. But I don't know if I'd want to be in that position. I'd rather sit here being grilled by you than having to face the panel.
Well, I've spent a life being tyrannized by clocks in the broadcast industry and everything, but I'm not sure that I could do exactly a 2 minute thing and get it and hit it right on the head. But that's what you got to do. So anyway.
But you're right. It's a really interesting atmosphere in there. I like to tell people that it still smells like a mall. It still smells like a Sears in the new headquarters building there.
You are in the basement of the Sears store.
It's really interesting seeing the old escalators and stuff like that. But like you said, though, I mean, really rapid fire series of votes yesterday. Blink and you miss it kind of thing if you're not paying attention to the agenda once the board comes back in from closed session. It's the sort of thing where, boy, I didn't know $5.4 billion for operations could get appropriated that quickly, but that's how it works. That's just how it works.
And $1.5 billion in borrowing for short-term lending. Right?
I mean, let's be clear about this. There is no way this budget works. There's not enough cash on hand to pay bills as they come in without this line of credit, without $1.555 billion in short-term credit. It's akin to a payday loan. And the reasons, a lot of governments use this sort of tactic, as we know, but it just kind of helps underscore the depth of the situation here, as far as the school system kind of managing almost on a month by month, day by day, week by week. So
this is matching their expenditures with their tax receipts, right?
That's the hard part, right? Yeah, I mean, you think about it, like if I'm, I got to manage a car payment, student loan, all the other regular bills that I have, but instead of getting paid every 2 weeks, I get paid every 6 months, right?
Yeah, so when the tax bills come in.
So I need cash fronted. In this case, a lot more cash than I could ever
even more than your
earning.
Student loan.
Yeah, that's that way. But I mean, I can sympathize with the situation that property tax receipts come in on a different basis, on a different rate rather. Right. But the basis for the problem is that reserves have been all but completely exhausted.
Because that's what you have reserves for, is to give you that little rubbery cushion there for when.
That's why the board erected this financial policy back in 2008. They wanted this on hand so they could kind of avoid these sorts of peaks and valleys as best they could. Those days are over.
So can you give me a sense, and I'm not even sure what my question is here, but I'll ramble into the question as best I can.
I do that too.
I have a sense that things are actually, as Frank Clark, the chairman of the board says, a little better than they were. That the kind of fiscal irresponsibility that was rampant a couple of years ago seems to be less so today. I mean, let's face it, they have a massive problem to try to overcome. And it seems to me like they're kind of climbing out of it a little bit. Am I just being wildly optimistic?
I don't blame you for wanting to feel optimistic. I have the same conflict personally. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are trying to cast this budget in this sort of light, like what you're talking about here, that last year the Chicago public schools were not just staring into the abyss, but they were pretty much falling right over the edge, and things had just reached a point where it was no longer sustainable. Now, this year, the narrative, at least from a lot of folks out there, is that we've just kind of stepped back and we're now just looking over the edge again. We're still at that point. We're still at that point.
Back up onto the edge.
And I feel that there is some truth to that. There is some truth to that. And there are some factors that have certainly improved the district's short-term financial picture and even its long-term financial picture. Don't get me wrong. There's new tax revenues coming in that for some reason were never tapped before, even though they were probably available for quite some time before this point. This new tax levy for pensions, teacher pensions that the state has helped authorize, in addition to what the city council and the board have approved in this levy for capital improvement projects, for infrastructure projects. That helps take a lot of pressure off of the operating budget. But at the same time, don't get it twisted, there's still some serious structural problems here. A lot of folks will tell you this is not a structurally balanced budget. They've done some things to kind of close the deficit for the year. There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts included in those assumptions. But right now, there are still a lot of factors that are putting immense pressure on the operating fund of the public school system.
I'll take another swipe at this, because I kind of think this is an important issue for us all to keep in mind. You said about last year, last year was laughable. They budgeted for $480 million. $480 million that they knew very well there wasn't much chance in hell that was going to come. And they created, we've had so much fun here talking about the 14-month year, the CPS 14-month year, where they're grabbing 2 months of this year's receipts for last year. So I remember sitting here a year ago and talking and saying, as bad as this is, I just don't even know how they're going to put a budget together next year at all. And somehow or other, they did, and it appears to be a little healthier than the one before. And some of that is because they have finally, or the city has finally passed taxes to start addressing some of these issues. And they were persuasive enough with the state that they got some money this year that they didn't think they were going to get, we think.
We don't have it yet.
We don't have all of it. Right.
And what's more speculative? What's more speculative? Is it more, and this is the question I pose to people and to myself sometimes, is it more speculative to assume that Springfield is going to come through with $480 million, or is it more speculative to assume that you're going to get $215 million this time around? Now, there are some differences in the dynamics, I suppose. You actually have legislation that's passed. You actually have commitments from legislative leaders saying we're going to get this done. But remember, we're banking on Springfield here. We're banking on the capital. We're banking on a capital that's in some serious dysfunction right now. And I'm not a gambling man, but if I was, I wouldn't, So I talked to a priest about this yesterday. Actually,
it's in your story this morning, and it's really great.
One of my colleagues over at the Chicago Sun-Times and I were able to buttonhole Michael Garanzini, one of the recent appointments, mayor's appointments to the school board. And I asked him about this, his suggestion was that he's not as pessimistic necessarily as I might be or as others might be about this coming through. And I think his point was that, listen, leaders in Springfield are hearing a lot of pressure from folks who are actually suffering from this impasse right now, A. And B, they all want to get reelected. We're presuming that they all want to get reelected. So things are reaching a point potentially where there's enough pressure that they know that if this doesn't come through, there's going to be a real problem.
Yeah. I found it interesting that the Civic Federation has condemned this budget, but in terms not anywhere near as stark as the way they were attacking last year's budget. So maybe even they are thinking that it's 15% less irresponsible than last year's budget or something. I don't know. But I mean, okay, let's deal with those things though, right? I mean, there are at least two gigantic holes in this budget. One of them is the CTU, which we'll talk about later, I guess. But this notion that the state of Illinois has committed to give CPS something like 205 or some round number around $200 million, right?
215.
215.
Yep.
But you have to satisfy the governor that there's been pension reform in order to get it, or something.
Yeah, and not to mention,
but nobody understands what that is.
Correct. That was the point I wanted to make. Is that, I mean, I think, I asked different sets of people about what this grand bargain on pension reform might entail, and I get three different answers sometimes. The rules of the game haven't really been established with enough clarity to satisfy me at this point, or I think a lot of other people. I think different folks are convinced of what the idea might be. Would it be Cullerton's consideration idea? Would it be getting downstate teachers to pay more into TRS? But there's so many factors here, right? And this is an election year, not to mention. So what is going to satisfy the governor? Ultimately, it's got to get his signature. And you've got obviously some comments from Rauner recently here that suggested. Well, I don't know what exactly they suggested because they were a bit contradictory as to what it's going to take to get this done.
And my source is reading your story, so so I mean it's who knows what Governor Rauner, given that it's an election year, is going to decide constitutes pension reform that he can live with. It might be almost nothing.
And, we also have to think about the House Speaker, too.
Right.
These are folks who play 3D chess. And so there's a lot of things that, I wish I knew about that I don't, admittedly. There's a lot of games that get played when it comes to kind of the public positioning of a lot of this stuff. But there needs to be an answer here soon. Otherwise, the district is going to have to, is in all likelihood going to have to come through with some serious level of cuts. And let's be honest here, this operating budget has already relied on a lot of cuts to schools that we have no reason to believe are fake in any way. I mean, schools are expressing a lot of pain coming from this.
Before we leave the budget room, the board room, the other thing, of course, is this 35 million, whatever it is, that they think they're going to milk out of the CTU. And maybe they will, I don't know, but that is, again, by no means a done deal, that's for sure.
Right. This is, I suspect we're going to see a significant degree of acceleration here as far as these contract talks are concerned once the school year starts. And you have the union, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more later, publicly trying to stir the pot again as far as some strike talks are concerned. Although there's some risks involved for the union as well, especially when it comes to all these negotiations that are happening downstate at the Capitol right now. Is there a deal in sight? I don't know. Karen Lewis recently expressed some optimism to me that talks were going pretty well. But that the framework of this deal that CPS offered in late January wasn't going to fly with members. We always talk about levers, right, that can be kind of pushed and pulled and adjusted to kind of get to a deal, and I think there is some flexibility there, but the district has sought to make its position very clear that there is not a lot of fiscal flexibility as far as whatever its contract offer might be. So, that sounds like an impasse to me, potentially. I
am so fascinated by this dynamic of where CPS and CTU are right now, because you have, in my assessment, you've got the CTU president, who is clearly a dynamic and very well-liked human being, who I think might be having some internal troubles with her organization. That it really did look like she kind of went back with a deal that she thought maybe she could sell, but she couldn't, although maybe not. Maybe that was all just a ruse too. Maybe they set up the big bargaining unit as a way of, but we've talked about that before. But there's a new player in this, in Forrest Claypool, and I think that he's given short shrift sometimes in his ability to be a bargainer and to be a hard-nosed bargainer. And I just have this weird feeling that these two have a kind of a real respect for each other. And it may not be that they like each other, but there's a whole different level of conversation going on. And
I think you're right.
And I'm sorry to be dragging on
No.
here, but it was so amazing to me to see that dynamic when the deal fell apart, and Forrest Claypool didn't get all bent out of shape in public about it, but he just came back like a month later and said, well, we're just going to get it because we're going to bake it into the budget. See, so so what do you do now?
Well, I think Claypool, there are certainly different ideologies involved here. I think my suspicion is that once you get into the room, there is a different dynamic than what you might see playing out publicly as far as the sniping is concerned. I think that there are some general understandings that have been kind of reached in there, especially when it comes to the financial situation and things of that nature. But is that enough to get you to a deal? Like you said, I mean, you've got to take something back that your members are ultimately going to sign off on and that you have to sell to your members as well. So that's going to be really interesting to see, especially as we get here past Labor Day and stuff like that. If they want to strike, what is it that they're going to walk out on? How are they going to justify it? And then how are they going to bring the members back in too? Especially if the school district and the mayor's office are going to continue asserting that the financial framework of what they tried offering back then is going to have to stay pretty rigid.
Have you seen any evidence that at a kind of a grassroots level that the rank and file of the CTU might be willing to be flexible on this, that they're not as hard-nosed about it as they were in the 2012 strike?
It's hard. I would hesitate against saying that there is universal accord within the union about what's happening here. This is a massive body, for starters, and there's factions involved, and there are, just as you would expect in any kind of organization of that size. Nobody is going to be of the same mind of anything. I mean, just look at how individual union members feel about the presidential election or the past Democratic candidates for the presidential election. There's a lot of tension there, philosophically. So let me put it this way. I think there are folks who want to stay in classrooms who don't want to go on strike. I think there are teachers who absolutely would want to strike, and both of them can put equally impassioned arguments forward for why that should be the case. What I couldn't tell you, though, is who's bigger, who's smaller, right? Yeah. Who has more of a say than others? There are definitely folks who are more vocal, who are louder than others, but does that mean they have more control? I don't really know that I can speculate too much on that. Yeah. But they're not necessarily of one mind on this. I can't say that they are.
It seems to me that the CPS side is taking the gamble. They're saying that they think it is maybe more split than the public understands, and that they're willing to ram this through and see what they can get out of it. But it's going to be it's going to be something to watch, and it's all going to unfold in the next few weeks.
I would suspect so. I would hope so too. I'm actually kind of looking. I want to see how this story ends.
I don't think it will. I'm sorry to tell you this. I started out in, 79 or something, covering CPS back when Joe Hannon was superintendent.
Wow.
And this conversation really isn't terribly different. It's just the numbers were smaller. That's my perception of it.
Well, that's interesting, though. I mean, that's something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, it seems like when I go through the clips and when I try to read up on history, it's kind of amazing how, like you said, how similar some of the basic dynamics are here, right? I mean, it seems like we're just constantly revisiting some of the same problems, some of the same issues, just with kind of a different cover on the book. And like you said, maybe some bigger numbers, right?
The numbers get bigger every year. That's all. The debt gets bigger every year. But it's, it seems to me that it's this kind of fundamental question of what do we want our public school system to be? And what are we willing to pay for? And it's a question that'll never be resolved. It's as old as the country. It's a debate that's been going on. Although there was, I suppose, a period there in the mid-century, last century, when people did seem to be proud of their schools, and I don't know.
I think they still are.
I think that's right. I think that is right, and more of it than you might imagine. I mean,
That's
I
a good
actually
point.
saw something this morning about some poll. I've never even heard of Anzalone List Grove.
Cool
I think
name.
maybe this poll was taken in the mayor's dining room or something, but it's 600 Chicagoans, and they kind of generally said that they're okay with the tax increase, and only 12% of them said they think this is Mayor Emanuel's fault because the structural deficit existed long before he became mayor, which is, I guess, a fair statement to make.
I think the mayor's office, I feel that the mayor's office is banking on that exact degree of sentiment. I would venture to guess that the mayor's office believes that when it comes to schools, like you said, property taxes, generally speaking with the public, are less of an issue, or property tax hikes for that matter, are less of an issue for the public, because I think they, folks can see that actually going into something, right? That it seems like a little bit more tangible. My school, my elementary school down the street, the high school that I want to send my kids to someday, I want that to survive. That's embedded in our civic fabric, right? Just like it's like our churches in a sense. It's got a physical presence there, and there's something much more spiritual about it too.
Right. Absolutely right.
And so if I own a $250,000 home and I'm paying an extra $245, the district says, to help shore up teacher pensions and to some of these other things, that's not as big of a deal. Now, granted, that $245 comes on top of a whole bunch of other money that I'm paying to shore up a whole bunch of other stuff in the city, and it's possible that more might be happening. So, at some, do you reach, there's a curve, right? Where's the point at which you see?
So true. That's so true. But I can't help but think that if I were advising the mayor at this point, I would say, look, your numbers are low. Your approval numbers are really low as it is. You might be able to pull yourself out of this by saying, I did all the really hard, dirty, heavy lifting. I did this for you, so vote for me again. I don't know. Maybe that's the plan. I don't know. Could we talk a little bit about the special ed? That's something we really have to get into this conversation. What is it that they did? They intermingled the funds from special education. Explain this.
Okay, so they did a lot, and I think there's a lot that folks are still trying to figure out. But hopefully I can summarize it on a basic level like this. Originally, schools would see their funding for special education come from downtown, and downtown would allocate positions based on the individual needs of each school building, right? Based on these individualized education plans, which are these legally mandated documents that dictate how each individual student with special needs, is taken care of within the school environment. This year, there's something entirely different, and what you see is that essentially, here's what it boils down to. CPS is saying, okay, school, you spent, say, $100,000 on special education services last year. And so we are going to give you that exact same amount of money into your budget. Rather than us just paying for it and sending you the positions, we are going to give you the $100,000 that you spent. We're going to put it into your budget, and it's going to be up to you to figure out how to make it work for the students that you have. So what we're asking you to do, school, is organize the class schedules of your special education students first, rather than just kind of attaching it to the end of that. I think the advocacy community and other folks in the city who are really interested in this sort of thing like that idea, because you want to make sure that the needs of your special education students are getting taken care of first.
So they get the first slice of the pie.
That's supposed to be the intention. The question is whether the slice of the pie that I've been given now to pay for this is A, substantial enough to cover all of the needs of my special education students, B, whether I'm going to have to dip into, and B, whether I'm going to have to dip into other funds that are meant for other purposes to help make that work before taking care of my general education population, before taking care of the rest of my students. And so when you're sitting here in the school office with your ledger, trying to make the numbers work, oftentimes that leaves principals with a very difficult decision. And I think that's what a lot of the pushback that you're seeing from the community right now, like, how is this actually going to work? And what ultimately happens, some folks are saying, is that it creates or it has at least the potential to create a schism within a school community where the needs of one population are pitted against the needs of another population. There's only so much resources to go around. There are legal mandates and priorities that you have to deal with on one end. And so what happens here? Does this put special education needs against, does it pit special education needs against the needs of the general education population? Some folks are saying that's what's happening out there. We'll have to see what happens when the school year starts and as we get into this sort of thing. But there are some very real concerns out there as to how this is actually going to work.
So it raises a very interesting question. How would you like to be a principal at a Chicago public school? I mean, they are pushing this decision-making stuff down into the school level in a way that they've never done before. And I guess maybe that has something to do with why so many principals are leaving. I don't know. You're giving less money, and you've got to deal with the parents.
Yeah, perhaps that is leading to. I don't think we can deny that the fiscal situation is definitely leading some people to pursue opportunities elsewhere. And I don't know that I can blame them. Yeah. But at the same time, there's a lot of devoted school leaders within schools all over the city who have been through a lot and are continuing to go through a lot and are sticking it out. Right. Teachers too. But yeah, it's not an easy position to be in, and I think. Access Living, for example, the disability advocacy rights organization, when it came out with its response to the fiscal 2017 budget, I'm paraphrasing here, but one of the things that they pointed out was that the district is pushing, like you said, a lot of difficult decisions onto principals, right? Student-based budgeting formulas, we're cutting that rate. Yeah. You have to figure out how to spend this money now. Mm-hmm. X, Y, and Z, your enrollment's down, so obviously your dollars are going to be dropping. Mm-hmm. You have to figure it out. To a certain extent, principals have always kind of had to deal with those sorts of responsibilities. But again, like you said, is it reaching a point where there's just so much more getting piled on that, that's the and there is some fairness in the idea that school principals obviously know their communities better than anyone in central office would. That's for sure. Yeah. They know
it's not all bad.
Right. Exactly. Right. Ideally, you have a leader who can work with your local school council, who can work with parents, who can make it all work, and obviously present the case that listen, we've only got so much money to go around. Right. But that is not an enviable position.
No,
that is not an enviable position to be in.
And I'm wondering about. I don't know whether these numbers actually exist or this can actually be properly brought into perspective, but I get the sense from looking at the budgets and the stories that there's been a pretty heavy increase in the special ed operation in the Chicago Public Schools in the last 10, 20 years or so. Do you have any sense of that? Are there more people with IEPs, individualized education programs, or whatever they're called, plans? Are there more of them than there were before, as expressed as a percentage of the population in the schools?
I think generally what the school system would argue, and what they have argued in a recent kind of analysis that they published here, is that the district has invested a lot more money into special education but not seen the results that you would expect, or that you would hope to see, rather, as far as academic achievement is concerned. Because believe me, academic achievement is an important factor here, and there's a huge gap, as you might expect, but it's too big, honestly. And so what the school district is trying to do is implement a system in which it takes a really hard look at how it is assessing students who are identified as needing special education. Let me put it that way. They want to basically do a complete reinvention of how special education works in the city, which is a lofty experiment, to put it that way. But I think the idea, part of the idea anyway, is that they want to make sure that they are properly identifying students who might need special education before actually referring them into special education programs. Some people would argue that this is a deliberate effort to try and limit the number of students who are getting special education services, and that presents a whole range of issues.
It sure does.
But at the same time, it's a very expensive program, and the district, I think, does want and has tried to take a hard look at how much money it is pouring into this and how it can potentially just kind of ease some of that burden by adjusting the way that it delivers these services.
See, there's an interesting parallel here too, because there are plenty of people who will tell you that it is in CPS's interest to try to do whatever they can to push the most experienced teachers out the door, because they're expensive.
They cost money.
Right? But CPS can't do that But a principal can, because a principal has a budget. You've got $600,000 to run this school, and you got 2 teachers who are gobbling up a third of your budget or whatever. Those numbers are stupid, but they're taking up a big part. So get rid of those teachers, and they're telling the principal, you're the one you have to decide. Maybe you don't want those expensive teachers. Maybe you could get 4 teachers instead of 3 if you had lesser paid younger teachers. And also, maybe you could have more money for that gym teacher if you just got rid of a couple of these special ed kids.
Well, I mean, that sets up a whole range of fraught legal issues here.
Yeah.
This is one of the most complex funding and regulatory systems that you'll find anywhere in modern public education, right? Mm-hmm. So any time a question like that might come up, you're immediately like facing a situation in which like
Hunger Games at the school level,
and the feds are going to get involved too, potentially, and there's going to be due process. I mean, lawsuits. That's just any number of potentially costly litigation and interventions from the state or the federal government that could result that could result from this sort of thing. The district needs to proceed carefully here for a lot of those reasons. I always say this, but it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out, whether they're actually going to be able to implement some of the changes that they're trying to identify in a way that passes legal muster, or that actually sees expenditure reductions, again, in a legal way, that sort of thing. I mean, they've tried this before, just last year, and they had to reverse course and, in fact, add to the amount of spending that they had to, push out. That's because, right, it didn't work. So, we're going to have to see what happens here. A lot of schools are going to be appealing the special education budgets that they've received. There is a pot of money out there that's kind of being held in reserve, purportedly, for these sorts of, additional teachers or positions that might be needed. Is it going to be enough? I don't know yet. So we'll have to see what happens.
It would be a different discussion on a different show, but it's also really kind of interesting to consider this idea that there might be alternative funding sources that the mayor and the school board just don't seem to be willing to explore. I mean, who knows what the validity is on this thing about maybe reforming the TIF laws, some kind of a transaction tax, or a different kind of income tax that could flow to the schools. There are plenty of people out there, Tom Tresser and others, who are saying that this is, as he says, Chicago is not broke. I mean, there would be ways of funding this and having all the things we want, but we keep relying on that property tax.
And general state aid, by the way.
And general state aid, absolutely.
The district is going to spend, I think I calculated it, around 35% of the more than $1 billion general state aid allocation that they expect to receive this year on debt service.
Incredible.
More than $300 million of money that could be going to classrooms on its credit card bill. No wonder the district needs more general state aid. I mean, that projection is it could increase here in recent years, depending on the forecasts that you look at. It's astounding when you think about it.
And that kind of leads me, finally, I think, to this issue of the capital, the borrowing for capital improvements, or whatever you want to call them. I'm one of the people who thinks that it's a good idea that the city finally activated that tax of whatever it is, 45 million or something. And too bad, if they had done it 10 years ago, we might be in better shape today, but they didn't. So, but that money is earmarked, right? That is lockboxed for capital projects, as I understand it.
Capital projects can mean a lot of things, though.
No, it's not.
But the essential idea is that, yes, this is a dedicated revenue stream, and by dedicated, I mean this is an amount of money that can only be spent on a certain kind of thing. Right. And so $45 million doesn't sound like much. I think it's actually, they're expecting like 47 this year. That doesn't sound like a lot of money in a year, but it's not. But think of what you could borrow against it, right? And think of what a bank might be willing to give, knowing that.
And apparently they have thought of that.
And they are. So suddenly, $45 million a year turns into something in the neighborhood of $1 billion. Over the course of this is, they're going to do that in phases more than likely. I don't think they'll do it all at once.
I can't believe how naive I felt about that, because I was thinking, well, 45 million, it's not much, but it'll build a school here and there once a year and an addition and maybe a few, projects. And then, then the very next day, it's like, oh, no, we're going to borrow $1 billion on that. And.
At probably very high interest rates, by the way.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, I would expect.
Yeah. But here's the thing. We need that. I mean, in addition to everything else that we're talking about, if you don't have modern, pleasant environments for kids to learn in, it's awful. And I've said so many times here that I went to Chicago Public School in the late 50s, and it was awful. It was just so hideous. It was dark and just awful place. And when I go into modern schools today, it's kind of a cool experience to be in there.
There's some beautiful buildings
we
out
need to do that. We need to do more of that. But what's really weird about it is that here they're talking about $1 billion plan, and they have no real capital budget expenditure long-range plan of any kind. It's just like, let's just get the money, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with it.
So, I mean, we better see more details on how they're going to spend the rest of the money. And ultimately, they're going to have to provide some sort of details before they take it out. Right now, all we really know about is how they're going to spend about $338 million of their capital budget right now. And in the future here, obviously, there's going to be a lot of additional construction happening. You're probably going to see a lot of play lots. You're going to see a lot of, like you said, needed infrastructure improvements at a lot of schools. But I think you're also going to see some completely new construction as well, too. And I think one thing that folks need to realize is that of all the things that Chicago Public Schools is, a social service agency, a healthcare agency, just the last line of defense for much of the city's impoverished population, it's also a real estate company when you think about it. They have a massive footprint all over the city. They have demographics that are shifting to concentrate in certain parts of the city while abandoning others. Meanwhile, the long-term projections for the amount of kids who are going to be in the system are declining, and the population already is declining. That is going to lead to some very difficult decisions here in the near future when it comes to building at the expense of other parts of the city that can barely fill schools. I
mean, that closing of the 50 schools was really almost just a prelude for what the next few years are going to show. It may not be numbers as large at one time, but you're right, it's an ongoing thing. And of course, there are all of these really difficult issues of I know the guys over at WBEZ have been doing this about about where you have schools that are less than a mile apart, and one of them has got 200 kids in it, and the other one is bursting at the seams. And instead of just joining these schools together, no, you're going to spend $50 million to build an addition on the other school. And that gets into the politics of race and politics of poverty and class, and there are all these things that's what makes Chicago so so interesting and so fraught. Yeah. So yeah. Well, anyway, I guess we kind of have to leave it there. But I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope you'll come back again sometime, because this story will never ever go away, and it'll be interesting. Oh, one other thing I just remembered I wanted to bring up. I just thought that it was a brilliant move on Rahm Emanuel's part to say, I'm going to spend $25 million, I'm going to air condition every classroom. Oh, by the way, I'm just going to this problem
a lot more than that.
Yeah, well, I thought it was $25 million.
Just for the recent phase, yeah.
But, okay. Yeah. Well,
but anyway, yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But, listen, we've had this problem since, 1898 or something, of, schools that are too hot in the summer. I'm solving that. That's, and he's got a line of money now that's going to allow him to purchase a lot of political capital here all across the city, or at least in important parts of the city for him. Yeah. Stay tuned. And hire a lot of electrical contractors too, yeah.
Bingo.
Oh, we could go on, ladies and gentlemen, but we're not going to, because Juan Perez Jr. has to go back to the Tribune Tower and start reporting again. He's taken a lot of time off to sit here with us today. So Juan, thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. I really do appreciate it. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It is a production of CAN TV, and we're proud of the fact that it is. And you can watch us anytime you want by going to this address and binge watching old Chicago newsrooms from back in April and stuff like that. We will be back next week with our pre-Labor Day show. We haven't figured out what it is yet, but we'll have something interesting for. No, that's not true. We got Ben Jarowski coming in next week. That'll be interesting. I forgot about that. See you next week with another show right here on CAN TV. Thanks much. Bye-bye.